Steelshod stays at Torva for a couple of days until they're sure the Ruskins have retreated back to Yerevan. Within a day or two of the siege breaking, a supply barge comes down from Yerevan, ostensibly to resupply the army. Instead, Steelshod finds it full of armed men ready for a fight with the Ruskins, who aren't here. The leader of this group is a familiar face, Olivenko, the cutter of Kamar. Turns out when Boris took over and blamed the Tarathi for Bogdanov's assassination, he began killing and driving out Tarathi worshippers. Olivenko and a few of the Taram mercs were still there, recruiting. They went underground and began organizing a resistance of sorts. They had planned on sabotaging the Ruskan army and reinforcing Torva. Most of the little mob is happy to hear the battle is already over, and that they will likely be welcomed back in Yerevan if they choose to return home. Olivenko tells the mercs to head back to Taram. He, however, has abdicated his command of the mercenary group. Losing his primary arm has left him ill-equipped to serve as a battle commander, in his eyes. His left hand is well trained to use his steel dagger defensively, but that's about it. Alexander offers him a job. Yoren enthusiastically supports the idea. He deeply admires Olivenko and has already learned a great deal about the art of dueling from him, to say nothing of the steel blade the master swordsman gifted him a few months earlier. Olivenko agrees to join up, for a little while anyway. He has more pointers he wants to give Yoren, although he asks that they also invite his new assistant. His name's Chauncey, but everyone calls him Chattering Chauncey, or Chattering Chauncey if they're an asshole. A young middish gutter snipe Olivenko picked up in Yerevan. Quick with a knife, quiet when he needs to be, but with a terrible stutter and a skittish demeanor. Yoren's interested in adding a few more sneaky types, so he accepts Chauncey as well, even if he has fairly low expectations of the fellow. Welcome aboard, Olivenko and Chauncey. In the midst of all this, Alexander gets some bad news. That's probably important enough to capitalize. Alexander gets some very bad news. Yeah, that's better. It's something he half expected when he heard what a shit show Yerevan had become, but it's worse than he feared. As a Tarathi priestess, building a new church, Elena was a prime target. She wasn't executed, though, or driven out of town. No, Boris gave her to Hakon, and the Vlari priest took her when he left. And as far as anyone knows, she's still alive, and in the clutches of the High Priest of Vlar, last seen heading downriver towards the open sea, several days before the siege of Torva even began. A brief aside may be in order. Though some monasteries and orders, such as the Knights Serpentes, require strict vows that can include abstinence, the main priesthood of Torath does not. Priests and priestesses are allowed to love, marry, and have children. They're encouraged to do so, even. Alexander had developed feelings for Elena. Mutual ones. So, he's not in such a good headspace anymore. Still, there's not much they can do. You can't track a ship. So all Alexander can really do is continue with his mission. Fight on Cadia's side, and hope he can find out where Hakon has gone. Steelshod departs from Torva. Vernon Cleaver asks to accompany them. No problem there. The group makes their way back to Arcadia with all haste. By the time they return, some word of their exploits has reached Marshall's ears, and Cleaver is shown swift audience with the Marshal when they arrive. When Lord Marshal sees Alexander and Yoren, he's a great deal less dismissive than last time. They ask for a higher pay rate, and he grants it. He tells them he will have a critical task for them soon enough. Svards have begun an all-out invasion in the south of Cadia. But, for now, they are to remain in Arcadia on alert, until he knows where he wants to send them. That's fine. While they were gone, Jaspar has identified a number of potential new recruits. They have to meet them, test them out, and put them through their paces. Here, I have to stop though. Put things in Arcadia on pause for a little while. See, I mentioned a while ago that Jaspar was actually the third character that Alexander's player had created. The second character he made was a Spitalian, and, as a group, we all talked about how to introduce her for a while. Then I made a suggestion to the player that runs Yorin, and we knew what we had to do. Remember, all three of us DM quite a bit. I'm the forever DM of the group, but I absolutely love playing under both of them. I said, "Hey man, what if you DM a segment in Spitalia?" We hadn't fleshed out the details of the region, so I gave him near total discretion to do so. I told him I had some ideas for Kassala, so not to assume too much there. But Spitalia was a fairly blank slate. All three of us made characters. Should I just include the players' names to make it easier to follow? Maybe after I get permission. Yorin's player would be DMing, but since the plan was to introduce these guys to the main game, he wanted a PC for that. And though I would be DMing normally, I needed a player for this part. This is one game where I was confident my DM PC wouldn't be a real problem. Already seen how excited they both were when regular NPC Steelshod managed to steal the spotlight and do something rad. And we're all great at keeping each other honest. So, the DM made Agrippa. Agrippa is a mercenary medico, competent at warfare, but primarily concerned with treating the sick and injured. He's had classical training in Kassala, and he's highly intelligent. He knows it, too. He's an arrogant bastard, but extremely good at his job. He insists on cutting-edge medical science, such as bathing regularly, and cleaning wounds of the invisible demons that live in dirt and cause sickness and gangrene. We had a lot of fun with Agrippa and how much legitimate medical knowledge we let him have, versus nonsense medieval superstition. When possible, I erred on letting him have real valuable knowledge of the practical ways to treat people, and superstitious nonsense as the explanation for those practices. Agrippa's most notable ability was his healing, of course. The party had been seriously suffering in the slow-as-balls healing they'd been getting. The core healing mechanic is that a trained person, example Orson, can throw you a d4 after a battle, and you heal that much. Then, a d4 per day. By contrast, Agrippa's core healing ability let him throw a d4 per 10 points of damage you had suffered in the fight. The difference would prove to be night and day. He had other stuff too, and has only gotten better as he gained tiers. One day, Agrippa will unashamedly claim to be the greatest doctor alive. And no one will really have a credible argument against him. He will literally get a tier called Miracle Worker. Getting ahead of myself again, sorry. Alexander's player had made Leona, a Spitalian infantry soldier, a hoplite, basically. Strong armor, huge shield, spear, and short sword. Leona is a highly defensive fighter. High dex, shield, and abilities focused mostly on enhancing defensive capability, at least at first. She deals small but reliable damage and whittles people down. Leona's background is as a farmer. Her and her brother left the farm to become soldiers. A couple years ago, Leona's brother died brutally in front of her. She spiraled out of the company she'd been with, and has grappled with depression and fear since then. On the surface, she's another macho soldier in the vein of Leon and Bear. Mostly interested in fighting, fucking, and getting drunk. But beneath that, she has some serious trauma. The player institutes a flaw. When she gets bloodied, she has to save or basically break and try to flee. It should be interesting. Finally, my character. Not a Spitalian. Middish, actually. A middle-aged, jolly fat monk named Hubert. He professes to be a monk from a remote Tarathi monastery, and keeps it vague. In truth, though, Hubert left the monastery when he was just a boy. He ran away after being abused by the older monks. Since then, he has done a wide variety of jobs, as a thief, a minstrel, a mercenary, and a scholar. His monk philosophy is not precisely Tarathi either. He is actually a part of an extremely small and eclectic cult. So eclectic, he's only been aware of a few other members besides himself and the man that mentored him. They hold that the purpose of life is to experience it to the fullest. They value new experiences. The more unique, the better. Hubert loves trying new foods, new drugs, seeing new places, learning new languages, etc. He's a dabbler, a jack of all trades. A good guy overall, very genial and friendly. He does have a somewhat flexible morality, though he recognizes that his pursuit of new experiences could lead him down a dark path. Of the few members of his cult that he's met, one of them was a man that he killed, as his new experiences devolved into some of the world's oldest, darkest experiences done for thrills. Hubert is surprisingly agile for a fat old dude, and has a smattering of hand-to-hand combat training. A real professional like Leona could still take him apart without breaking a sweat, of course, but he knows a bit of poisons, carries hidden needles to deliver them, and a bit about alchemy, with some dangerous pots and a padded bandolier. Like I said, a dabbler. The alchemy was mostly for the benefit of the guy who plays Yoren. He put together a custom alchemy system, with a lot of input from me to simplify and streamline it, and he wanted Yoren to learn alchemy. This would provide him with a logical teacher. I didn't mind, though. We made alchemical recipes and reagents expensive, and alchemy, consequently, was powerful. We rolled randomly for Hubert's recipes, and I lucked out and got a mix of utility and combat, including classic alchemist's fire. Definitely the most deadly weapon at my disposal. Another fun thing. These characters were where we first really began testing out the system's skills. Remember, my rule is write down the skills you want. Don't care what they're called. Just make them reasonable, not too broad. Agrippa picked up skills like biology, military order, and steady hands. Leona got recognizable stuff like athletics and acrobatics, but also one of my favorite observational insight skills ever, suspicion. For Hubert, I gave him stuff like schmoozing, nature, and mummery. Overall, I was really pleased with the skill system in action. We've all used similar loose skill policies since in other games, and it's always been a fun bit of customization. We generally hate the intro session where everyone meets and conveniently decides to become an inseparable team. So, we decided that this odd little group were already fast friends. They served together a couple of years before in one of the dozens of ever-present civil wars between the Spitalian city-states. Agrippa as a medic, Leona as a soldier, Hubert as a cook. With that, the trio was born. Established that Leona and Hubert had met up again, and were on their way to see Agrippa at his current station. Session 1 opened in the city-state of Tarraconensis. Ah, Christ, the names. Okay, I'm a big enough man to admit that I had some control issues at first. More than I expected to. When I saw the map of Spitalia my buddy had made, and the names of all the regions, I was a little shocked. I had figured he'd just do, like, a city-state or two. And I bitched about the names. They didn't sound Spitalian enough. Whatever that means. Places like Bisconia, Marpatania, Tarraconensis. They just sounded off. In a way, I was right. He'd basically just taken some old maps and texts from around 500 AD Spain and Italy, taken a bunch of names from there, and changed 1 or 2 letters or syllables. An illustration of how we think. My strategy is usually to make up words that sound right, but are often nonsense. Or take actual words in the language and compound new names. His strategy was just different. I eased up, realizing I was being a control freak. I'd like to say it was the one and only time I complained about a GMing decision made by one of my buddies, but you wouldn't believe me anyway. Anyway, I swallowed my tongue, and we dove into the game. The grand city-state of Tarraconensis. I'll admit, his city map looked more detailed than any map of mine. The early session was just the trio meeting up, shooting the shit. The Principessa of Tarraconensis, daughter of Duke Garibaldi, was soon to be married in a few days' time. An alliance tying Tarraconensis to a neighboring city-state. We'd come for the festivities, mostly. I saw a priest of Torath standing in a town square ranting about evil witches plaguing the woods outside and infiltrating the city, and rolled my eyes a little. After a while, we wandered down to a tavern to get ourselves some refreshments. At the tavern was when shit started going nuts. There was this young couple in one corner of the tavern, sucking face like one of them was hiding jewels in their throat. All of a sudden, a group of men burst into the tavern, point out the young men and woman. I heard them specifically call out the woman as their target, and they draw steel. The man draws a sword and moves to defend his lover, but he's outnumbered and pretty obviously outclassed. The poor girl is terrified, crying to the patrons for help. What the fuck would you do? Leona drew her spear, Agrippa his warhammer, Hubert maneuvered around to flank the ruffians. Leona catcalled them, mocked them, and got their attention. She began dancing around them with her shield. The stranger was still hard pressed by one of the attackers, injured and losing ground. I slipped up behind his attackers and pricked him with a needle. Dude failed his save hard, and in a few moments he was on the ground, paralyzed, and struggling to breathe. With some help from Agrippa, Leona handled the rest of them. I think 1 or 2 might have fled. We looked around at the aftermath. Agrippa went to treat the wounds of the young man. Hubert checked on the young woman. She thanked us profusely. She introduced herself as Isabel and her injured lover as Juan. Then, more men burst into the tavern. Armed men. Lots of armed men wearing the garb of Tarraconensian guards. They surrounded us, demanded Leona put down her weapons, and step away from the Principessa. Principessa Isabel Garibaldi. Isabel reassured her father's guards that we had saved her, not attacked her, and suggested we should be presented to her father for a reward. We agreed, of course. A reward sounded good after all. But it also occurred to us to be on guard. After all, we'd seen Isabel and Juan in the corner, before the assassins arrived. And everyone in Tarraconensis knew that in a few days' time, Principessa Isabel was going to marry Princeps Aistulf Lombard. So who the fuck is Juan? Thank you for tuning in to Steelshod, a series by Mostly Rights, narrated by Tailforge. You can find every chapter in text format, as well as character sheets, setting information, maps, and rule documents on the Steelshod tabletop system in the link below. If you'd like to support the channel, you can pop down to the description and use the Patreon link for recurring donations, the PayPal.me link for one-time donations, the Teespring link for shirts with the incredibly cool background art by Nobody, or use the DriveThruRPG affiliate link the next time you're looking to try a new system. If you'd like to support the author, you can find Steelshod merch on the MostlyRights.com store, or donate to the Mostly Rights Patreon, which are both linked on reddit.com/r/mostlyrights down below.